All right, well, good morning. Thanks everyone for having me here. Pleasure to speak to you on some of the national rental market trends that we're seeing. So as Giacomo just alluded to, Urbanation and Rentsync, Rentals.ca, have been partnering over the last few years to produce a national rent report. So for those of you who wait eagerly every year for the CMHC data to come out, to see that it's released a few months late and only once a year. This is a very welcome development. We can report on the national rental market on a timely basis, right? We're reporting monthly based on tens of thousands of listings every month. So it gives us very insightful pieces of data to be able to monitor, not only at the local level here in Toronto, but really across the province and other provinces across the region and in Canada. The data that we're going to talk about today really does speak to the national market, but also drills down further into the Toronto trends. What we found here in the October data was that for the first time since COVID, rents in Canada declined. Now, they only declined by a very small amount, as you can see. Take into consideration how dramatic the shift in growth has been just in the last 6 months. So 6 months ago, rents in Canada were increasing by basically double digits. And then over the course of the last 6 months, we've seen rents decelerate and then now moving into a disinflationary environment. This is very abnormal, but it's also very abnormal to see rents grow by double digits. So the abnormal growth that we were seeing coming out of COVID in 2022 and 2023 and the early part of 2024 has now also moved into an abnormal situation where rents are declining. So these two abnormalities are actually normalizing rent growth to a degree. If you look at average rents today, compared to where they were 5 years ago, they're up by about 16.5%. So that works out to average annual growth of just over 3%. If you were to look at the long-term 25, 30-year trend for rent growth in Canada, it's basically 3%. So this big volatility that we've seen coming in and out of COVID is really starting to normalize, I'd say, at this point. However, there are some very important factors that are contributing to the big change in rent growth that we're seeing across the country. One is supply. For the first time, we're seeing apartment completions in Canada reach levels that we really haven't seen in decades. And this is coming from both PBRs and also, obviously, condo apartments, which have been the driving force for rental market supply in most big cities across the country for some time now. We actually, for the first time since the early 1990s, have almost the equivalent number of condos and purpose-built rentals under construction across Canada. This is contributing to rental completion numbers that we haven't seen in decades. In the last 12 months, we've seen nearly 80,000 purpose-built rental units come to completion. Over the same time period, we've had about 52,000 condos. A lot of condos, as we know, ultimately end up in the rental stock, right? They're pre-sold to investors, particularly here in Toronto, and then they bring them into the rental market. So the combination of these two supply forces is one factor that's obviously contributing to the slowdown in rent growth. Now, the government realizes that this supply growth hasn't been enough to keep pace with demand, right? So they're now starting to look towards attacking the demand side. And we've seen some new policies introduced just recently on the immigration front. So previously, the immigration targets for this year and next year were 500,000 for Canada. They've been revised down over the next couple of years to just over 365,000. So that is a level that is still well above COVID numbers, which were just above 300,000. So they're still very much operating at record highs. So we're still going to see very strong positive growth on the immigration front. The big change here is coming from non-permanent residents, temporary residents, right? The government is looking to reduce the percentage of the Canadian population that's represented by temporary residents from 7% currently to around 5%. It doesn't sound like a meaningful change, but it's actually going to require the number of net non-permanent residents that enter the country every year to decline by 900,000 over the next 2 years. Okay, that's coming off of growth of about 1.5 million in the last 2 years, but it is a dramatic reversal from the population inflows that the country's been experiencing over the last couple of years. So this is already starting to impact population flows, right? We're starting to see this in the rental data, right? Some of the cities across the country that rely on foreign students are seeing some of the biggest declines in rents. And some of the buildings that we track that are known to have a high percentage of international students are seeing some of the highest levels of vacancy. So even though a lot of these changes aren't going to really come into place until next year, the messaging that the government is putting out is actually leading to some pretty substantial declines in foreign student enrollment. So a lot of the universities and private colleges are reporting that this fall, the number of foreign students that came into their schools was down by about 50%, right? So that compares to where we were last year when foreign student enrollments were going through the roof. So another really big factor that's influencing and distorting, I'd say, the rental markets in Canada. So this change in population policy is going to effectively result in a net decline of 0.4% in the Canadian population over the next 2 years. Now that comes off of population growth of 3% annually over the last couple of years, but it will result in a net decline of around 165,000 people. So basically when I look at these numbers, it tells me that the Canadian population is essentially going to flatline at a record high over the next few years. So realizing that the Canadian population has increased by over 3 million just in the last few years, we're going to maintain that level of population, but we will not maintain the level of growth that we've been experiencing over the last couple of years. So let's see how this has been impacting the rental market. One of the interesting things that we've noticed from these declines is that most of it has actually been coming from the condo sector. Purpose-built rents were actually up 1.7% annually in October. There's still significant growth happening in the PBR space for the most affordable rental apartments represented by studios, and also those that are in the shortest supply. 3-bedroom apartments are seeing still substantial growth. Most of the declines that we're seeing in rents in the condo sector are coming from smaller units, right? This is where most of the supply infusion has been happening, right? Investors have been buying smaller condo apartments. With condo completions reaching record highs, we've seen a flood of these smaller units hit the market. A year or two ago, you could see a studio apartment in Toronto going for $2,300, $2,400 a month. Those rents have dropped $2,000 a month, in some cases $1,900 a month. It was not sustainable. The market was so undersupplied that people were bidding up 300 and 400 square foot apartments well above $2,000 a month. Now that supply is coming in of that form, we're seeing that the rents are declining the most in that segment. Interestingly, 3-bedroom apartments for condos are actually still up. Again, the supply story there. We don't build many 3-bedroom apartments, and that has contributed to relatively more stable growth in that segment of the market. Regionally, we see that the most expensive provinces in Ontario and BC have seen the largest declines in rents. There's been a marginal decline in Quebec, that's mostly coming out of Montreal, whereas in most of the other provinces across the country, we're still seeing strong growth. In Saskatchewan, double-digit growth. Alberta still growing quite strongly. But one thing we've been noticing out west is that Alberta, a year and a half ago, which was the leader in rent inflation in Canada, is now starting to move back towards the middle of the pack, and that growth is transitioning into Saskatchewan and Manitoba, where rents are relatively more affordable. It used to be the case that you saw rental markets experience the fastest growth because of employment trends. People would move to markets where job opportunities were best. Unemployment is pretty much low across the country. So people are moving because more because of housing supply and affordability, right? Rents in Calgary have gotten expensive. Rents in BC are expensive. Rents are expensive. People are migrating towards less expensive markets. It's somewhat surprising. When I put on the news this morning as I was getting ready, and they were reporting weather across the country. In Saskatoon, it was minus 26 this morning. But you can get an apartment for $1,100 a month. Across the country as well, we're seeing that 3-bedroom apartments are outperforming. So this is just a breakdown of rents per unit across all the major provinces. And there's an ongoing theme here where most of the deflation is happening in the smaller units, and pretty much everywhere you're seeing relatively stronger growth in 3-bedroom rents. A lot of these charts, actually all of these charts are included in our latest rental market reports online. And with that, you see that growth has shifted into less expensive markets. Lloydminster, which kind of straddles the Saskatchewan and Alberta borders, has been for most of this year the fastest growing province in terms of average rents. $1,100 a month will do that for you in terms of average rents. But you see a pretty consistent thing here where relatively less expensive markets in Alberta, Manitoba, Saskatchewan are leading rent growth across the country. And you really don't see many markets in Ontario and BC
that are posting growth above 3 or 4%. In fact, I think the only city that's in Ontario that's growing above 4% a year was Sarnia, where the average rent is $1,400 a month. In BC, same sort of situation. Nanaimo as well, relatively affordable rents when you compare them to other parts of the province. So most of the declines are happening in the big centers within Canada. The 4 largest cities in the country are seeing the bulk of rent declines right now. So as Max alluded to, Vancouver and Toronto have been seeing rent declines pretty consistently for the last 7 to 8 months. We're now starting to see Calgary turn into negative territory for rents. Montreal as well. At the beginning of this year, rents in Calgary were growing by double digits in January. So this is a very remarkable shift in a fairly short period of time. Ottawa rents are pretty stable, pretty flat year over year. And again, the affordability theme. The fastest growing amongst Canada's 6 largest cities is Edmonton, where the average rent is like $1,500 a month, right? $600 a month cheaper than living in Calgary. We're seeing that migration trend in towards these more affordable markets. Now, drilling into Toronto, this is data that comes from an extremely deep data set of condo lease transactions that Urbanation tracks. The majority of rental supply that's been built in the GTA over the last 15 years has been in the form of condos. Most condos get leased through an agent, right? There's a transactional record for those lease transactions. What we found was that in the third quarter of this year, lease transactions reached a record high. They grew by more than 30% from where they were at this time last year. The issue isn't on the demand side for condo rentals, it's on the supply side. Condo rental listings increased 52% year over year in Q3. Why? Because condo completions are at a record high. These investor-held units that were bought several years ago are being added as rental units in the rental pool. Even though our research shows that most of them are cash flow negative, deeply cash flow negative, it's difficult to sell a condo in today's marketplace, right? But it's not too difficult to rent it out. So as a result, we've seen that the ratio of leases to listings, which is a good indicator of demand to supply, has declined. It's below average right now, indicating that the market is moderating. And as a result, rents are slipping. Now, they're coming off of extremely strong growth, as we talked about earlier, in 2022 and 2023. And they're still fairly close to their record high, right? They're still averaging above $4 a square foot. And interestingly, even with this decline in rents that we saw in the condo segment in Q3, the 10-year average is still maintained at 5%, right? We've seen extremely solid growth in the Toronto condo rental market over the last decade. So again, this rebalances things, right? Coming off of double-digit growth in the last couple of years, which was not sustainable, and I would argue rents overshot in 2023. Between the spring and the summer of 2023, rents in Toronto increased 6% in 6 months. It's highly unusual. And again, a lot of that came from the huge influx of foreign students that came into the marketplace during that very short period of time. We were tracking new rental buildings that were coming up for occupancy in the early summer to mid part of the summer last year. 400 unit buildings that were getting leased out in 2 months. And we were looking at our data saying, how is this possible? And we started to talk to the leasing agents. They said foreign students leased out the entire building in a matter of weeks. That's not happening anymore, right? So those rents are starting to reach a new equilibrium. Same situation here in the condo market in Toronto, where the smallest units are seeing the biggest deflation. So what this chart is showing is the average rents per square foot by square footage unit size range. And then to the right of that is the year-over-year decline in rents. So they're declining across the board, but you can see a very strong negative correlation here between how rents are performing and the size of the suite. Smallest units are seeing the bulk of the declines. Larger units, not as much, 3%, 2%. In the purpose-built space, we're also seeing more supply enter the marketplace. In the third quarter of 2024, we had the highest number of purpose-built rental completions that we've seen on a quarterly basis going back to the early 90s. In fact, over the last 12 months in the GTHA, there's been about 6,000 purpose-built rental units that have been completed. Now, it's not really that much, but it's a lot compared to a few years ago when we were only building 1,000 or 2,000 units on an annual basis. So we're tripling the amount of new purpose-built rental supply that's coming into the market But it's still a very small fraction if you consider that, we're building 25, 30,000 condos a year, and most of that is entering the rental market. It's still a fairly minor share, but it is a big shift from what we've been experiencing over the last decade. As that's happened, we've seen that the overall occupancy rate in the purpose-built market has come down. Now, this gets influenced by new buildings that are coming up for lease. So the occupancy numbers are reflective of newer stock, right? It's not the entire rental stock, right? The new rental stock is, maybe 150 buildings or so. There's thousands of older purpose-built rental buildings. So when new buildings come up for occupancy, obviously there's a time period required to lease up those buildings, and so the occupancy numbers tend to come down. But when we look at stabilized buildings, so buildings that have been leased up, they've gone through their lease up, the vacancy numbers still remain quite low. So these are the vacancy numbers that we collect on a quarterly basis from the rental industry for buildings that have been completed since the year 2000. We do this consistently every quarter. And what we've seen is that these vacancy rate numbers have been moving up, but they've remained below 3% since COVID, okay? 3%, 3 to 4% is generally considered to be a neutral or balanced vacancy rate, okay? So even with some easing in the rental market, with all of this new supply that's been built from both the condo sector and the purpose-built rental space, vacancy rates still remain below normal. Now that's a little bit of deflation in the purpose-built rental space. We've seen average rents come off about 2% from where they were at this time last year, but they're still, as you can see, operating at very close to record highs. We've also seen some more incentives come into the marketplace. It's becoming a little bit more common to see, the 1 month free come back in, things like that. I think this is more of just a rebalancing of overheated activity that occurred in 2022, 2023. Now, when we look at supply, it tells us something very interesting that's going to be coming in the next few years. In the third quarter of 2024, purpose-built rental construction starts in the GTHA dropped 40%. Year-to-date, purpose-built rental construction is down about 40 to 50% from where we were in 2021, prior to when interest rates were increasing. So this is reversing some actual solid progress that we saw on the construction front, right? Year to year, we were seeing rental construction actually grow in Toronto. So those earlier charts that I showed you with purpose-built rental construction reaching record highs and rental completions outpacing condo completions, that is not a Toronto story. That's happening elsewhere in the country. In Toronto, rental construction has basically stalled. In Q3, there were 0 rental construction starts in the city of Toronto. 0, for the first time that we started tracking this data. So rental construction's coming down at a time when the population has obviously increased very quickly. We also have a pretty significant pipeline of rental projects that are sitting there waiting to get built. Most of them aren't approved. About 30% of the 150,000 or so units that are in the supply pipeline that haven't started construction are approved, right? We need to do a much better job focusing on purpose-built rental construction and getting these units approved so they can start construction. Even those units that are approved, most of them aren't financially viable to proceed, right? The economics just simply don't work. Even with some of the new government incentives that have come in, right? The removal of HST, some of the other things that the City of Toronto is working towards as well. Most developers we talk to say it's just not going to move the needle enough, unfortunately. We have a very massive of units that are in the application stage right now. We need to move these through the application stage quicker and provide some incentives for purpose-built rental developers to get some more supply into the system. Because what we're seeing at the early stages is very troubling, supply moving forward. We also know that we're not building very many condos anymore, or we're not going to be. We're on track to see fewer than 5,000 new condo sales this year in the GTHA. You'd have to look back to 1996 to see a lower level of new condo sales. So if you aren't selling new condos today, you're not going to be starting construction on them tomorrow, and you won't be delivering them in 3 to 4 years. So this supply that we're seeing happening in the market today is actually going to lead to a higher level of completions the next couple of years, followed by a steep drop-off in deliveries in the 2026, 2027 period, okay? So the rental market is going to feel very well supplied in the short term, especially here in Toronto. About 29,000 condos are scheduled for occupancy in 2025. It'll be a record year next year, right? And that goes back to the record year for pre-sales in 2021. There's usually about a 4 to 5 year delay between pre-sale activity and closings. So we'll see a record year in 2025, But that'll start to slow down as we move through the second half of 2026 and into 2027. By 2028, there's less than 10,000 units scheduled for occupancy, okay? So there's going to be some headwinds for the rental market in the next years. The slowdown in population, the increase in supply. I still think the rental market is structurally undersupplied, so I'm not expecting to see a prolonged period of rent deflation. I think it's actually going to be fairly short-lived, but we'll see rents level out and probably trend below normal. But that will be followed by a period in 2026, 2027 of above average rent growth as supply gets squeezed substantially with completion slowing down. And we know this because of how dramatic the slowdown in construction has been from both purpose-built rentals and condos. All of this data that I've been talking about can be extracted from our database, okay? So Urbanation Rentsync database tracks all new rental activity, it tracks secondary condo rental activity, and it tracks in real time rental market information from the older stock of purpose-built rentals as well. So this is a portal that you guys can demo here at the back, but I have some numbers here that are just astonishing on the number of rental units that we track. So out of the new purpose-built rentals, we track 413 buildings that have been built since the early 2000s in Toronto, Hamilton, the Greater Golden Horseshoe. Last year we've expanded into Ottawa. That's about 68,000 new rental units that have been built in the last 20 years. We also track 2,600 older stock purpose-built rental buildings. So these would be buildings built pre-2000. That's an inventory of over 300,000 purpose-built rental units. And then within Toronto, right, where most of the rental supply is in the condo segment, we're tracking that secondary rental supply as well. That's over 3,000 buildings, over 500,000 units. So all told, we track rental activity across about 1 million units in the Greater Golden Horseshoe and Ottawa regions. And we have plans to expand in other parts of the country as well. But this is a massive amount of data that you all can have access to, right? We have a very detailed search engine here that allows you to produce statistics on a unit type basis, on a square footage basis. If you want to drill into buildings of a certain suite size and suite size range, you could do that here. And it's going to give you rents in real time updated because of the power of rentals.ca and Rentsync data in conjunction with this platform that we've built with Urbanation's database as well. The data is reported, average rents, rent per square foot. We have vacancy data, we have absorption data, parking lockers. You can get into very specific profile information on every building. When it was built, when it started construction, when lease-up occurred, how long did lease-up take? You know, we get into the data by unit type, unit size. The power of the rentals.ca, Rentsync, and Urbanation database allows you to track data not only on the unit type basis, but individual size segments within each unit type. Right? This is the most powerful database of rental market information in the country. So I encourage you to have a demo. The data here is presented, as you can see, in historical format, updated frequently, full profile information, photos, description of building amenities, incentives, suite features and finishes, who the target renter profile is. It's all here in the database. So thank you very much, and I'll pass it over to David for his segment.
I will be talking about rent insights. I'm David Aizikov, work in the data services department, and I work with the data team. We manage the data, we analyze the data, and we work closely with our partners and friends over at Urbanation, the monthly rent report, and a lot of the reporting and data services really as a whole. So today I want to get started by talking a little bit about demographics. And then from there, we'll talk a little bit about the changes in the market, changes in renter preferences, changes in renter activity, and how that is really a result of, shifts in the market as a whole. Okay? So first and foremost, I want to talk a little bit about distribution of available units in the market, because it will be important throughout the presentation. Really, first and foremost, studios and one-beds are the ones that are growing in number in terms of availability. So this is actively available units. One-beds represent just under 50% of the overall population of available units. Studios are third, and then the remainder between 2 and 3 bed units. And this is important because this is representative of what, regardless of what renters are looking for, is actually available on market. Okay, so the reason this is important is because at the end of the day, renters all have preferences. This is probably not news to anyone here, but when we look at renters, we typically break them down into one of 4 general profiles, which are either students, young professionals, families, or older downsizers or retirees. And again, it's important because depending on the segment, they will have a preference typically for a specific unit type. Students will typically prefer studios, 2s and 3s, if they're looking to room. Young professionals, depending on if they're singles, couples, if they work from home potentially, will look at 1 and 2s, or sometimes bachelors. Families typically prefer 2 and 3 bed units, and then older downsizers, retirees, really depending on their income level will really look across the entire board. 42% of respondents answered that they were in a relationship. This is important because this tells us that about 42% are going to minimally typically look at either larger 1 beds or 2 beds. We also know that 16% of respondents said that they have children, another important factor because it tells us about 16% of the renters that we're looking at have children. That's going to be another consideration within their unit type preference. Okay. Now, when we actually look at who these renters are, so we did a survey. We actually can do surveys. We reach out directly to renters. We can inquire about them. We learn a little bit about what their motivations are, who they are, and this gives us a better understanding of what's actually in the market. What we see here is that about 30% of them are single. Okay, another 15% are in a relationship, and 13.5% are married with no kids. This is really the segment that is clamoring for those 1 beds, a vast majority. And this is important because, again, we know that 1 beds are just under 50% of the market, but we see that well over 50% of the market in some cases are looking for larger 1 beds specifically. We also see about 50% of respondents typically say that they're interested in living alone. Okay, 49%, so just under half, say that they're interested in a 2+ bed. Again, very important because just under 30% or a third of units, just under 20% of units are larger. Okay, so there's this imbalance between what is available and what renters are actively looking for. Okay. Renters as a whole, certainly in urban markets, are typically going to be single. Okay, again, this data comes directly from our survey. What we did is we compared our live active prospects within the City of Toronto against the Ontario average, and we see that as a whole, renters not necessarily dominated, but there's a much higher incidence of singles, and then as we get to larger couples with and families with children, there's lower relative percentage of them. There is a slight representation of divorcees and widowers. That hasn't always been the case, but that is growing marginally over time. Okay, but an important factor is that while singles and young couples have always dominated this, young families are actually growing. So while they'll still remained relatively under indexed relative to the broader population, that relative population is actually growing, and this is really a result of worsening home ownership affordability. We're seeing that more and more people that are in late stage in their lives, with children that are aging, are being relegated to the rental market for a longer period of time. And that's also further creating changes in not only the demographics of renters, but also in the preferences of renters. And we'll see that more and more and more throughout the presentation. Okay. When we look at the actual age of renters, so again, on the right side here, we have the City of Toronto. On the left side here, we have the broader country. And this, again, comes directly from our survey. So what we had done is we did a survey of Ontario, just about 1,000 respondents. We did Toronto, and then we also surveyed the broader country. In the City of Toronto, we see that there is an over-representation of younger professionals, ages 18 really to 34. The older we get, the less relative, the lower relative proportion there are of these individuals. However, that's not really representative of the whole picture. I mentioned this, that renters in the City of Toronto are aging, and that's exactly what we're seeing here. So what we've done is we've done the survey. We did the survey recently. We did the survey last year. We compared the results, and what we're seeing is that within the City of Toronto specifically, renters are getting older, okay? The 18 to or 25 to 34 and 35 to 44 year groups, which are typically the ones that have shown more growth, are actually declining. Young students are growing, and that's really a factor of these are people that are entering the rental market. They don't have any other alternatives. They can't remain in place, to keep their rents low. They're entering the market, which is why we see a large number. That middle age group of younger millennials, maybe a little older millennials, they're dropping, and that's likely because a lot of these people are staying in place. They're choosing not to move. And then we see a growth in the older downsizers, retirees, families. A lot of this is going to come down to necessity. These are people that are moving out of circumstance. These are not necessarily renters by choice. These are renters due to circumstance. And that's really a picture of what's happening in the market right now as a whole. We talked about some of the active demographics. Now I want to talk a little bit about some of the insights that we learned based on how renters are feeling in the market, what are their preferences, what are their outlooks, and really, what are their opinions? So we found that 32% of renters would recommend their current rental. Not a great number, just under a third. However, that's up from 25% in 2023. So that tells us even though the market is slowing, there are a lot of concerns in the market as a whole. People's opinions are improving. And I think that's really a factor of people are becoming less picky, people are becoming more accepting, and they're more understanding of the circumstances they fall into. 5% only would not recommend. That's down from 12% from the year before. Okay, and when we look as a whole, we see that, is now a good time to move? Just about a third of people agree. That's up from last year. Again, really good sign from the perspective of overall outlook from the renter's perspective. Okay, when we look at pricing expectations, generally misaligned. Not necessarily something that's news to anyone here, unfortunately, but we see that if we look at the distribution of how much renters want to pay, it represents just about an even in normal distribution. Just over half, or about 75% of renters are actually looking to spend under the average rent in the city of Toronto. Okay, that's a very important factor because at the end of the day, only 50% of units are going to be under the average, 50% are going to be over the average. But we have 75% of renters, active renters, that are wishful or hopeful or intending to pay under that halfway mark. When we break that down by age, so we correlated how much renters intended to pay with their age. What we see is that younger renters, again, nothing necessarily opening here. Younger renters, typically less affluent, typically more cost sensitive. They're going to kind of peak earlier on. They're looking for these more affordable units. As we go through the life stages, however, what we see is gradual increase of incomes and then a gradual decrease of incomes. So older downsizers, or these are individuals aged about 35 to 54 years old, they typically have stronger affordability. They peak right in that mid-mark of rent, right in the center of the distribution. And that's representative of a lot of the people that would otherwise have left the rental market. These are people that would otherwise be purchasing homes but have been priced out. And then as we get to the older downsizers, again, these are retirees, a mix of retirees, a mix of old homeowners, and a mix of people that are just living there due to circumstance. When we look at, now, we spoke a little bit about the availability of listings. Now I want to talk about the distribution of unit types based on the lead distribution or lead submission. So we see that just over half of all leads are actually being submitted for one beds. Again, just under half of all units are one beds. So that means there's more demand there for this particular unit type than there is availability. Studios represent just about 20%, which again, there's clearly an imbalance there. Studios are significantly underserved. And then another interesting factor is that studios are typically much lower. In Vancouver, Calgary, studios typically represent somewhere around 15% of overall lead submissions. In the city of Toronto, we are far higher than the average. The national average, again, just about 15. One beds are typically in the range of 35 to 50%. Again, we're just over 50%. Two beds are at 20%. Three beds just under 4%. The city of Toronto is really heavily over-interested, I would say, in studios and one-beds. Vastly different from the broader country. Okay. When we look at the year-over-year changes in lead submissions by bedroom, what we actually see is that studios are growing the fastest. Studios have grown 31% in overall distribution, while 1 and 2 beds are declining. 3 beds are also growing. That tells us is that from our data, we see that 1 and 2 beds, these are a lot of times the units that are, they're coming down in their overall availability, telling us that the units that are already occupied are turning over less, while studios and 3 beds are the ones that are coming to market, they're turning over. The renters that stay in studios specifically typically don't stay in them as long as 1 and 2 beds. So these are really just the units that are available, and also this is people searching for affordability. Studios and 3 beds offer substantially improved affordability relative to 1 and 2 beds, and we see that really across the country, where the least affordable units are coming down as a proportion of distribution, whereas the more affordable units are growing. This section here is really interesting. We're taking a bit of a departure from talking about Canadian rental trends, and we're looking at international rental traffic, which as a whole is down. What we looked at is we looked at the top 5 countries, which were in Canada, this is where we are, the USA, the UK, France, and India. Overall, Canada has seen a pretty substantial decline in overall online search traffic. This data comes from a combination of our internal metrics as well as Google search trends. When we look at Google search, obviously, the first place that a renter is going to start their rental search is on Google. You search, apartments for rent, X city, apartments for rent in this country. And that's exactly what this is. So this is Google search trends for Canadian rentals. And we see that other than the USA, which if we look at October to October, is actually down 22% year over year. If we look at a 3-month rolling average, it's down just about 30%. If we look November to November, it's actually up, 86%. We call that the Trump phenomenon. Besides that, international traffic is down. UK is down 55%, France is down 46%, and India, a subject that has been a contentious subject or very prevalent, is also down 67%. Okay, when we actually look at the movement in these markets, we see that there has been quite a substantial shift. Last year, India was the 3rd biggest market in terms of overall international search activity in Canada. This year, we're down to number 5. Okay, in 2023, Canada made up 9% of online renter traffic. So Canadians in Canada made up just under 90% of all search activity. In 2024, that's up to 95%. Okay, so what that tells us is that there are fewer and fewer people looking internationally for rentals in Canada. This is likely a leading indicator of people that are interested in moving to the country, and really as a result of reduced immigration targets, lowered immigration targets, and concerns around housing affordability as a whole across the country. Interestingly, India, again, which was number 3, in 2020 up to 2023 held the number 3 spot. It made up about 2.4% of overall rental traffic in 2022. That's now down to just about 0.4%. Okay. Now the top 10 list, we are only looking at the top 5, but the overall top 10 also includes some additional markets. France, Philippines, Brazil, Nigeria, they all come up quite quickly. And then we have some additional markets such as Turkey, Germany, Australia, Hong Kong. They all shift, but really the top 5 has remained the same throughout the last 5+ years. So we've spoken, again, a little bit about unit types. We've spoken about international demand. We've spoken about Canadian rental demand. But that's only one part, the unit. The building itself is another component of this. In the building, what we do is typically, when a renter makes their decision, they're looking at the location, they're looking at the unit, and they look at the level of amenitization. With amenities, we like to break them out into one of 3 categories, internally at least, and that is affordability-focused amenities, whether it's parking included, whether it's utilities included, energy efficient, what have you. Convenience. So that is transit availability, shopping availability, parking, my apologies. And then last but not least, lifestyle. Lifestyle amenities are that is the subject that we touch on the most. That's, the most exciting one, and it's representative of the quality of life features and nice finishes that people are looking for. Air conditioning, pet friendly, laundry ensuite, fitness center. Across the country, amenity preferences are changing differently. Okay, in British Columbia, we see that lifestyle is actually slowly taking a downturn, where affordability is the one that's growing the fastest. In the prairies, we actually see a difference. We see lifestyle continues to trend upwards. Lifestyle amenities are up anywhere from 90 to 160%. Affordability is growing, albeit at a much lower relative rate. When we look at Toronto, this is based on rentals data, we see that lifestyle amenities remain champ. Last year, they slowed down. We saw a greater focus on affordability. This year, that's changed again. This year, we're seeing more of a focus on lifestyle. So we see fitness centers up 96%. Now, this data takes into account the changes in overall filter usage. We see that year over year, renters continue to use more and more and more filters when they're actually actively looking for units. And this data is not only that, but it's based off of lead submission. So we're looking at which properties renters are actively submitting leads for. Okay. Interestingly, so we see that lifestyle amenities are growing the fastest. Affordability amenities are actually, when we break it out as a segment, are going the second fastest. They're up on average of about 44% within the city of Toronto. So spoke a lot about this. I want to talk quickly about a new feature we have within the platform we call Market Insights. It's meant to give you a quick snapshot, more generalized view of what's happening in the market, whereas Urbanation is meant as a direct comping tool that gives you really detailed information at the building level. You can break it down, look at individual rents, and you can see how rents are trending over time. This is meant to just give you a quick snapshot of what's happening in this particular community. We've distilled it down. You have various filters, so you can break it out by whether it's apartment or condo. You can break it out for the month. You can look at a specific FSA, and you just get a quick snapshot of the average rents, the availability, the amenities, the distribution of rents, and we also offer a long-term trend average rent.